Hey everyone, welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds. I'm Nerdarchist Ted, and today I'm joined by.
Eric is Dave.
So when fantasy goes wild wild west in your D&D game, let's talk about it. Jump down the description below where you can sign up for Nerdarchy the newsletter, get weekly gaming tips, as well as learn how to game with us.
All right, so we're going to do some mashing up here. We're going to genre mash. We're going to take fantasy. We're going to get it right into our Wild Wild West. Now we have there's two different avenues that we're thinking you could go for doing this kind of thing. You can go, okay, I'm going to recreate American history, but with fantasy critters. Right, and by recreate I mean like replacing, the Chinese were brought in to work on the railroad. You also had terrible atrocities were committed against Native Americans. So you can replace these different peoples with fantasy critters, right? And not really use the real world things. Or you could go, we were kind of talking about, of this idea of what if North America was already inhabited by a fantasy world, right? It already existed here. Native Americans lived alongside Indians and dwarves and gnomes, and they all had their own thing going on, and maybe there was some magic, but the tech level wasn't there. It was still, fantasy, so
Right.
nothing above a crossbow, nothing complex. Well, then, Europeans come in. So we start with like what would have been colonial settling, right?
Uh-huh.
But then we don't actually want to play that game. We want to play Wild Wild West, right? So what we have to do is we have to fast forward. So I did some loose checking and investigating online to figure out like timelines. Now, this may not be wholly accurate, and I am definitely not a history buff. So, we have like 146 years of build-up time from when the colonial America would have happened till like Wild Wild West, to the Western expansion. So like you would have to like kind of like recreate a little bit of those things, and you'd have to decide like what's important to having a Western. So that's probably where we should start at.
All right, so having what's important to a Western, you're going to need the frontier towns. You're going to need places where, you know, the lawman is the law, and what he says goes. And his laws might be different than the guy next door's laws, but do what you're supposed to do, and all's happy hunky dory. But you get on the wrong side of that guy, and you're gonna spend some time in jail. You're gonna need showdowns. You're gonna need cowboy justice. You're gonna need the technology that's necessary for all of this. So clock towers, pistols, like these are things that are known, because you can't have a showdown at high noon if you don't know what high noon is.
Exactly. Well, and also, you can't have a train heist without trains, and you want to have shootouts and that kind of thing. And also, like, one of the things we could kind of touch on, like, we kind of like brought it up a little bit at the very beginning, but the idea of merging or replacing. And I think we're talking about more like replacing. I don't know if it would be replacing or merging, but like you could do a Shadowrun thing, right?
Uh-huh.
Where something happens, an event happens that integrates either the Wild Wild West or the fantasy world, fantasy genre into what's going on. So there are both options as well. But we kind of went with that, let's like, it was already there. The two worlds just haven't happened to have met yet.
Right.
It is a fantasy world that we're thinking about. So Native Americans, in this case, would have access to shamanistic magic. Absolutely. We have dwarves roaming around. We have elves roaming around. But that being said, they still don't have access to firearms and explosives, which these are going to be big turning points. So we'd have to like kind of figure out when we started what happened to the Native Americans, what happened to the elves, what happened to the dwarves, or any other fantasy races you wanted to incorporate.
Uh-huh.
Maybe because of all these other demi-humans already living here, like the slave trade may never make it to North America in our historical context.
Uh-huh.
So, Africans don't come in as slaves. We could actually have them as another branch of colonizers or other immigrants, really,
Uh-huh.
as opposed to slaves. Instead, we could have, either the elves or the dwarves are kind of like filling that role, or gnomes or halflings or
Mhm.
one of the other races that weren't able to establish themselves. I like the idea of maybe even having like dwarving strongholds that are like holdouts, as well as elven and Indian nations that kind of team up. And if like I would have fun with taking North America and kind of like re-partitioning things off and having some of these holdout areas in addition to some of the stuff you would expect.
So like I would take the dwarves and I would make them even much more recluse. Like as the colonists are settling in and essentially conquering and taking over lands from, whoever held them, the dwarves have decided, all right, well, we're gonna draw the line in the rock, as opposed to the sand, and we're gonna take and we're gonna hold this stronghold, and like they're gonna be isolated to just like a pair of mountains or a mountain range, and that's it. They're not going to let anyone in that's not a dwarf, and the dwarves aren't going to go out all that often. So like you could have some dwarves that have been turned into slaves, and like they'd love to be able to make it back to their people, and if they would, they'd be welcomed with open arms. But perhaps the dwarves that aren't slaves, like just aren't seen anymore. They just don't come out, and that could be a campaign crux to be able to look at. Maybe their smiths are trying to replicate the firearms that are had by the colonists, and it's like, well, you know, how do we get rifles and pistols and be able to take back our kin? How do we get to take back our lands? And that could be a whole campaign in and of itself. Either as you're the colonists, you're the cowboys fighting against them, or you're the dwarves fighting against the cowboys.
Yeah, you could definitely have fun with it. You could do things like the Elven and Native American nations were pushed into Canada or into Mexico. You could have a lot of fun with that depending on what kind of critters you wanted to add to your world. Are there other things like giants and orcs, goblins, that kind of stuff? Maybe they have been replaced as slaves. They're demi-humans, they're a little monstrous. Maybe they aren't seen as even being human. And I mean that's one of the things, with slavery. They always, no matter who was being enslaved, they always try and dehumanize them and make them seem like less than human to make it seem like it's okay or right to do this evil atrocity.
Right. So, like, depending upon how you want to re-envision and change, your world, this history, you can take it and twist it, completely dump it on its side, be like, all right, here's my take on it. Here's what I want to do, and it's really open to however you want to go with it. I think you could have a lot of fun taking something that's a typical D&D trope and saying, oh well, we're gonna add this into this Western feel. Pistols don't have to do a lot of damage. I mean, you could correlate it to crossbow and longbow damage, and still treat everything just the same. Or you can go into the DMG and take the firearm rules right out of there.
Good to see you're repping, Nate. I hate that idea personally, but it is absolutely a way you could do it. If I'm gonna have gunslingers in my world, I want guns to be deadly. I want them to be powerful and impactful. It would open things up for a gunslinger class for sure. And you could also have freemen that were dwarves or other races that somehow earned their freedom as well to kind of like mix them in. You'd still have to deal with. You'd probably have to deal with heavy amounts of racism more than likely. But then again, in a frontier town in the Wild Wild West, it's like you're gonna live and die by the gun. So if you're able to survive there, chances are people aren't gonna want to mess with you because you're probably pretty tough.
So I was just leaving the options out there. I'm not necessarily saying I would go in either direction, but
Antimatter rifles all the way. It's in the DMG.
it is in the DMG. But however you want to cowboy it up, the idea is to mix the ideas that is truly this is what it is to be a gunslinger, to be a cowboy, to be in the Wild Wild West, and this is what it takes to be D&D, and we're going to put them together, and we're going to say, here's how you do it. You've still got the ability to add fantastic critters. You've got the ability to add magic and all the craziness that's going on there. Yeah, and oh, there can still be dungeons, there can still be things, there's still going to be all the typical D&D isms, but we're just going to add in the craziness of the Wild Wild West and the frontier towns.
Well, what happens when like someone shows up and they're like, "I'm the new sheriff in town." So it happens they happen to be a red dragon, and like, what do you do? How does that work? But also, you might have assets that you didn't have before. Like, you may have the option of trying to run it over with a train, or shooting it with a cannon.
These are things that aren't typically known of in your D&D setting, and yeah, sometimes you can have cannons on your boats, but they're not usually in towns as well. So
Well, in the Western, in the wars they had them, so could
no, what
absolutely.
I'm saying in typical D&D.
Well, yeah, well, even if you're playing strict fantasy, you probably don't even have cannons on a ship. You're probably still using catapults and ballista. I mean, depending on what kind of D&D world you have
Right.
going on. But cannons do make it a little more fun.
Cannons do make it more fun.
There's definitely some key points. Actually, now I kind of want to play in this game. I think it would be fun, and there's so many different directions you could go. You could use the standard, Western tropes of, trying to run the bad guys out of town, the bad guys trying to run you out of town, bank heists, train heists, all that stuff would be a lot of fun. And then you have the added idea that maybe you're a Native American or Elven sympathizer, so you're kind of working with them, and you're trying to push back against this expansion. There's a lot of different ways you could go with a game like this.
Absolutely. So the question is how would you do it? Do you like our version? Would you play in this game? Or would you do it some other way? It's a great place down in the comments below. You can continue that conversation and let us know your opinions while you're down there. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
You can always tweet at us at Nerdarchy over on Twitter.
So until next time, stay nerdy.